This is a talk. Okay, this is my current 1 hour road talk. But you're going to see the middle 20 minutes. Which means that I cut a prefix and I reduced a suffix to a bullet list. Okay? I want to tell you something about what is in the missing prefix because it sets the tone for the whole talk. So I'm usually giving this presentation in front of a lay audience of computer scientists who don't have a clue what real-time systems people do for a living. So the prefix is trying to get across to these folks, what do we do for a living? What do systems people do for a living? They solve resource allocation problems. What do real-time systems people do for a living? They solve resource allocation problems with an eye towards being able to enable the validation of time constraints. Now, for a resource allocation problem to be interesting, there has to be some tension. There has to be an opposing force. What opposes us? It's capacity loss. Where does capacity loss come from? If you use execution time budgets that are too pessimistic, you have capacity loss. If you use a scheduler that's not optimal, you may have capacity loss. On a multiprocessor, you may be using an optimal scheduler, but its runtime overheads are too high. You have capacity loss. So what I tell them is that we solve real-time related resource allocation problems, and the game that we're trying to play is to eliminate or to avoid capacity loss. So you're going to hear this capacity loss theme throughout this talk. I got tired of this problem that I think I'm working on not having a name, so I named it. Unfortunately, I'm the only one who seems to want to use this name. I call it the 1 out of M problem. And for me, it's a problem about capacity loss, and this is the problem that arises when you try to use a multi-core platform in a safety-critical setting. And it's the problem where the capacity loss can get so out of hand that you negate the processing capacity of all those additional cores that I gave you. So I give you M cores worth of capacity, and you get about 1 core's worth of bang out of that buck. That's the 1 out of M problem. And again, it's a problem about capacity loss. And this has led to the common practice that we heard about earlier in avionics of simply disabling all but 1 core, which for me personally is not a very exciting resource allocation policy. In terms of the roots of this problem, we've seen today that much of this has to do with shared hard resources that are not predictably managed. So I'll talk a little bit about that in the context of our solution. That's one attempt that the academic community has made towards trying to address this problem. Another approach is mixed criticality schedulability analysis, which wasn't really proposed thinking about multi-core originally, but has also been applied in a multi-core context. And this is about provisioning tasks less pessimistically, also reducing capacity loss. The last time I gave this talk, it was to a room full of mixed criticality schedulability experts who didn't know much about hardware management, so I swapped in some mixed criticality slides, and I have swapped out the hardware management ones, because you guys all know about that stuff. Under mixed criticality schedulability analysis, instead of 1 worst-case execution time parameter, a task has a set of execution time estimates. We call these things PETs, provisioned execution time. And this is a thing that's of relevance in a system with multiple criticality levels. This was proposed by Steve Vestal when he was working in the avionics industry at Honeywell. And what he suggested to do was provision systems based upon the criticality levels at which they live. And it actually gets a little bit worse than this, because a task, no matter which criticality level it lives at, has to have a provisioned execution time at every level. That's a little bit of an overstatement, but we'll let that one go. So for example, for a highly critical level A task, maybe I'm determining these pets by means of some static timing analysis tool, which is very pessimistic. For a level B task, maybe I'm using a measurement-based process to determine the worst case execution time. At level C, for all I know, it's an average case. So generally what you're going to see as you go down these criticality levels is that the pets that are used get to be lower and lower. Now, what's really weird here is that the definition of correctness changes. You don't just talk about the system being correct in a categorical way. You do this in a per level way. And the weird thing here is you're fundamentally forced of pretending like one system is a set of systems, one per criticality level. And we talk about the level X system being correct or not, where X is a criticality level. And formally, the system is correct at level X if and only if all level X tasks meet their timing requirements, assuming all tasks at all levels stay within the level X pets. And this is a weird thing, as I have told you, because even though there's one physical system that's being analyzed, you have to play this mental game of viewing it as if it's multiple different systems. You're analyzing the same system with different proof obligations and different analysis assumptions for different variants. And these are mental variants. It's the same physical system. All right, so MC squared is our project, and it stands for Mixed Criticality on Multicore. And this is an attempt to ease capacity loss on a multi-core machine by taking two approaches that have been largely investigated separately: the management of shared hardware resources and the usage of mixed criticality schedulability analysis, and try to apply these both within the same setting. This is what the MC squared project is all about. These are our starting assumptions, which I think are important to articulate to make sure that you have appropriate expectations of me here. I'm thinking when I talk about multi-core, a modest core count. So think something like quad core. Don't be thinking about a 64-core Tylera machine. A modest number of criticality levels. So in theoretical work on mixed criticality scheduling, they usually assume two. In our discussions with Prakash, who was here earlier, that seemed to him to be too constraining. There's been some theoretical work where there are an infinite number of criticality levels. That doesn't seem very interesting either. So we assume some modest number of criticality levels. And this does not necessarily have to match up exactly with DO 178, B, or C, if you know what those standards are. And what was our motivation in this project? We're academics. We don't build airplanes, even though avionics is sort of a motivation here. What our project is about is to come up with a reasonable development platform that enables us to explore interesting resource allocation trade-offs in this space. And that's what we're doing. And in particular, an express non-goal is to create a framework that I could put in an airplane and fly it tomorrow. That's way, way above my pay grade. So we're going to be looking at this slide with some embellishments for a good chunk of the rest of the talk, actually. So this is my illustration of MC squared on an ARM A9 platform, which is a quad-core machine. And you can see it's got 4 CPUs. It's got an L2 cache, which is shared, and there are L1 per core instruction and data caches. It's got a gigabyte of DRAM that's partitioned into 8 banks. The scheduling basics here, if you're a hardcore real-time schedulability and scheduling aficionado, they're pretty basic. We prioritize higher criticality levels over lower ones. We schedule the level A and B tasks, so A is the highest level, by partitioning. Level A is scheduled by a static table-oriented approach, a cyclic executive. Level B is scheduled via rate monotonic. They have hard real-time constraints. And what's somewhat unique about our framework in the world of mixed criticality scheduling is we have a soft real-time level, which is level C. And it's scheduled by means of the global EDF scheduler. And the reason for this is underlined by about a decade's worth of work on soft real-time scheduling with global EDF and related schedulers by our group. So we provision tasks in a criticality-oriented way. And in our experiments, we usually do it like this. The level C tasks, which are soft real-time, we provision them based upon the average case. We don't have the static timing analysis tool, so all of our pets are determined via a measurement process. And so the level B pets are going to be worst case observed values. And for the level A ones, we apply some kind of an inflation factor for safety. Now, when I try to present this framework so quickly like this, it all seems so simple. But there's a major schedulability analysis component that underlies all this that makes sure all of this stuff works. And as I alluded to earlier, this is really the culmination of probably about 30 to 50 papers worth of pretty hardcore schedulability analysis work that came out of our group. Now, as far as hardware allocation is concerned, I don't have to tell you about way-based and set-based partitioning of the cache because that was already discussed. I had assumed that would be the case, and it turned out to be. So that lets you allocate rectangular regions if you apply both of these things together in the shared cache to different sets of tasks and even the operating system. The allocations I'm depicting for you here now are not the real ones. They're just easy ones to draw in PowerPoint. We actually have an optimization framework based upon linear programming that will determine these cache allocations for you in a way that optimizes schedulability. Or to spin it a different way that minimizes capacity loss. And it's fairly easy to assign the DRAM banks to different groups of tasks in the operating system. So as I said, the allocations I'm showing you here are not the real ones. These are just easy ones to draw. And this is the real way it looks. So this figure is a little bit busy. So what I'm showing you is how the LLC, the last level cache, is divvied up at the top, and how the DRAM banks are divvied up at the bottom. So the way the cache is divvied up, some subset of the ways and all of the colors are given over to the soft real-time level C in the operating system. And the other side is going to be used by the level A and B tasks on a per core basis. And in particular, the level A, B subsystem on each core gets 4 colors. Those double lines that you see there, those are the things that are set by the linear programming optimization framework. As far as DRAM is concerned, level C in the operating system take 4 banks, and we feel like since level C soft real-time having to share DRAM with the operating system is not such a big deal. The more critical level A and B tasks get dedicated per core banks. By the way, in most work on hardware management and isolation, to the best of my knowledge, very few people talk about the operating system. The operating system uses memory and cache just like tasks do, so it has to be dealt with. So I'm going to conclude here by showing you 2 graphs. So we've done lots and lots of experiments over lots and lots of papers, and these basically break down into 2 categories of experiments. One's where we look at the effects of all this from the point of view of individual tasks, and one where we look at the effects of all this in a more holistic way for the entire system. So here's an example of a kind of a graph that comes out of the experiments when we look at the impacts of all this from the viewpoint of an individual task. This is some benchmark task that I don't remember, but at the level at which I'm discussing this, it doesn't really matter. So the x-axis down here, I'm fixing the number of colors in the cache to be all the colors. And what I'm changing across the x-axis is I'm giving a bigger and bigger cache area by allocating more ways. And all I'm plotting here is a measured worst case execution time under different conditions. So under 3 of the policies being measured, there's a stress-inducing background workload that has been designed to be evil to create contention for shared hardware resources. And for this red line, there's no stress-inducing background workload. So you can think of that as a kind of an ideal that you would like to be able to reach. So what are these curves? This top one, these are W sets, assuming neither cache or DRAM management has been turned on. Well, this is what happens if you manage the DRAM but not the cache. This is what happens if you manage the cache and not the DRAM. So why do those two curves cross? So if I give you sufficient cache, it stops mattering that you manage the DRAM. But if I give you just a little bit of cache, it does matter that you manage the DRAM. And here's what you get if you put both of these things together. So this is substantially better than that green curve where nothing's managed. We don't quite get to the red curve, which is the ideal, although if I give you a sufficient cache space, I'm getting fairly close. Why do they not exactly line up on top of each other? It's because I'm not managing all of the shared resources. I don't manage the TLB. I don't manage these cache registers that Hichel was talking about. I don't manage the bus. So it's actually not necessary that you manage all shared hardware resources. You have to make a choice. You manage the ones you can manage, and you account for the ones you can't manage. And we're not managing everything. So we try to assess the impacts of this in a more holistic way by running overhead-aware schedulability experiments. So let me try to explain the nature of this graph. So these experiments generate tons of graphs. So this is one graph out of about 500 in one experiment. So what we do is we implement a bunch of schemes, and we get our system, this ARM-A9, and we measure relevant overheads that impact schedulability. And then we systematically generate lots and lots of random task systems at random. And we check their schedulability with the overheads included. The x-axis in this particular graph is the total system utilization without hardware management. The y-axis for different schemes, I'm just plotting for you the fraction of the generated systems that were deemed to be schedulable. Now, it's interesting to note we're on a quad-core machine, and I can give you total utilizations bigger than 4. The reason for this is if I turn on hardware management, execution times decrease, and therefore I can accommodate total utilizations that are bigger than 4. Viewing utilizations through the eyes of the original execution costs that were there in an unmanaged system. How do you interpret a point in this graph? That point right there means of the task systems that we generated with a total utilization of 4.5 in a system without hardware management, 88% were scheduled under the red scheme. I haven't told you what the schemes are yet. So what are these schemes? This is uniprocessor EDF. That reflects the current industry standard of turning off all but one core. By the way, what you want to see in these graphs, they'll all cave to 0 eventually. You want them to cave to 0 further to the right. Bjorn, who happened to leave, and one of the results in his dissertation was that partition EDF is a very good hard real-time scheduler when you consider overheads. And it does better than uniprocessor EDF, but not dramatically so. Well, you can apply hardware management to anything, so you can apply it to partitioned EDF, and that gains you something. This is MC squared, but without hardware management. So I'm using Vestal's mixed criticality schedulability analysis here, but I'm not managing the hardware. And this is doing both. So compared to the de facto standard at the beginning of this graph, I'm able to handle workloads 8 times bigger. This would be an appropriate point to declare victory over the 1 out of m problem and do my victory dance. Except This study was done entirely within an artificial world of task systems that don't do anything. They don't interact with each other. They don't share memory. The common sorts of complexities that occur in real systems aren't happening here. So now this is the suffix of the hour-long talk. It's a bullet list. The current work is to try to extend all this to talk about real-world systems. So one thing that real-world systems do is that tasks and also the OS, they share memory pages. So what about that? So we had a paper in the last RTSS that talks about how to doctor all this stuff up and make it work well enough if tasks interact with each other through producer-consumer buffers. We had a paper that Namhoon just presented 2 days ago about a read-only kind of sharing that happens through shared libraries. So how do you economically account for shared libraries and get all the hardware management to work? We have a paper we're working on now that introduces sharing between the operating system and application level tasks that occurs when interrupt-driven I/O takes place. And then there's another paper under construction dealing with mode changes. Mode changes are actually pretty interesting because you actually have to support multiple sets of task systems. And any one task system actually occupies CPU resources at a time, but they all occupy DRAM space at a time. And usually these allocations of hardware resources are done offline. And so you're forced to try to figure out how to do allocation with respect to lots of different task systems simultaneously and make everything work out. And what makes that even more complicated is modes are usually defined such that modes can share tasks, which means you can't just think about different modes independently. They all get intertwined and interconnected in very complicated ways. So the tail end of this, I don't know if you're going to put this stuff online, but there's a big list of MC squared papers, and hopefully I didn't take too much time.